At our wedding, my husband announced he'd given his mother our home, cars, and savings. He never read page 7. My husband stood up at our wedding reception and said he had a surprise. We were halfway through dinner. 200 people. Candles, flowers, the kind of venue that takes a year to book. He picked up the mic during what was supposed to be the toast portion of the evening, and I thought he was going to say something sentimental. I thought he was going to talk about the day we met, or make a joke about the first time I cooked for him and burned everything. He said, "I want to share something with everyone tonight. A few weeks ago, I made a decision I'm really proud of." He looked at his mother in the front row. She was already smiling. He announced that he had signed documents attempting to transfer our apartment, both cars, and had already moved our joint savings into an account she controlled. As a gift, he said. To honor her, he called it a surprise for the family. I was standing 3 feet away from him, in my wedding dress, in front of 200 people who had come to celebrate what they believed was the beginning of something good. I looked down at the ring he had put on my finger 4 hours earlier. Then I looked at Patricia, still nodding in the front row, and then back at him. He had the expression of someone who has done something he considers impressive and is waiting for the room to recognize it. I reached into the clutch on the table beside me and took out my phone. I had suspected something was coming. I had spent 2 weeks with that suspicion. I just hadn't known it would be at our own wedding, in front of this particular room, with him announcing it through a microphone into the venue PA system. He had made it very easy to document. For context, I'm 27. I work as a financial analyst, which matters for the rest of this story. I had been with Marcus for 3 years before we got married, and in those 3 years I had learned a lot about how his family operated. His mother, Patricia, is the kind of person who frames control as love. She had opinions about everything: where we lived, what we ate, when we visited, what kind of wedding we were having. Marcus mostly agreed with her. He called it respecting his parents. I called it something else, but I had loved him enough to navigate around it. The condo we owned, I had funded 70% of the down payment. My money, earned and saved over 6 years. The joint savings account had roughly equal contributions. The cars were in both our names. Patricia had never liked me. She said once, at a family dinner about 18 months into the relationship, that she worried Marcus was settling. She said it in that particular way people say things they want you to hear while maintaining the ability to claim they were misunderstood. Marcus had said "Mom" in a warning tone and changed the subject. I had smiled and passed the bread. That was the dynamic over 3 years. She made moves. He deflected mildly without actually changing anything. I absorbed it and kept going. She had wanted Marcus to marry someone from their extended social circle, a specific kind of background, a specific kind of deference. I was not from their social circle, and I was not particularly deferential, which she seemed to experience as a personal inconvenience. She had looked at the fact that I was generally even-tempered and non-confrontational and concluded that I was someone who could be managed, that I would prioritize the relationship over my own interests to avoid conflict. She wasn't entirely wrong that I had absorbed a lot. I had absorbed the seating chart being rearranged 2 weeks before the wedding without anyone asking me. I had absorbed the venue deposit being rerouted through Marcus's personal account instead of our joint account, which he explained as a timing issue. I had absorbed Patricia telling a table of her friends that I was still finding my footing in a tone that sounded kind and wasn't. What she had miscalculated was the difference between someone who avoids conflict and someone who documents everything while appearing to avoid conflict. 3 months before the wedding, a colleague who had been through a difficult divorce suggested I get a prenuptial agreement. I brought it up with Marcus. He agreed without much discussion, which at the time I took as a sign of trust. He signed every page at the attorney's office without stopping to read them. What he didn't read carefully was page 7. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was doing my usual review of household expenses and noticed something in the joint account. A transfer. Not large enough to trigger an automatic alert, but large enough that it didn't match anything I could identify. I went through the month's expenses line by line. It didn't correspond to any wedding vendor, any household bill, any subscription. I pulled the full transaction history going back 60 days. There were 4 transfers, spaced unevenly mid-sized amounts that could individually pass as wedding expenses if you didn't cross-reference them against actual vendor invoices. I cross-referenced them. None of them matched. Together, they represented a meaningful portion of what we had built up in joint savings over the prior 18 months. I didn't say anything to Marcus. I wasn't certain yet what I was looking at, And I had learned over 3 years that raising concerns before you have documentation tends to produce explanations that are difficult to verify. So instead of asking questions, I went through every wedding contract we had signed and compared every payment. Nothing matched the transfers. I called my attorney that evening. I described the pattern, sent her the records, and asked what our options were. She reviewed the prenup carefully. She explained that because of how the clause was drafted, specifying my separate contributions and establishing traceability of those funds, I had a strong contractual basis to seek emergency relief if the transfers proved to be unauthorized. She could prepare a dispute notification for the bank, a formal filing citing suspected unauthorized transfer of joint funds, which would trigger the bank's compliance review process. That review would flag the account and slow outgoing transfers while it was processed. It wasn't a court order. It was the first step in a process that could lead to one. She said she'd need my authorization to have it ready to file on short notice. I gave her the authorization that night. I told her I hoped I was wrong about what I was seeing. I wasn't. I want to explain what the prenup clause actually did, because it sounds more dramatic than it was, and I think the realistic version is more interesting. The prenuptial agreement contained a provision specifying that if either party transferred jointly held assets above a defined threshold without the other's documented consent, the non-transferring party had grounds to immediately pursue emergency preservation measures, including seeking court relief. The clause also established traceability of my separately contributed funds, specifically the 70% I had funded toward the down payment on the condo, so that in any legal proceeding, those assets could be clearly identified as separately sourced. My attorney had drafted this clause deliberately. It was not standard language. Marcus's attorney reviewed it, initialed it as reviewed, and did not flag it. Marcus signed it on the same page as his attorney's initials, turning the page as he went. What happened when I sent the word to my attorney was a sequence of things, not an instant event. She filed a dispute notification with the bank, citing suspected unauthorized transfer of joint funds and attaching the prenup clause as a contractual basis. The bank's compliance process, upon receiving a formal dispute from a joint account holder with supporting documentation, initiated a review that flagged the account and suspended outgoing transfers pending verification. This was not a court order. It was the bank's own process responding to a legitimate dispute filing. Getting a court order would come next if needed. It was not instant. It would take hours to initiate and days to fully process. Once the bank placed the temporary restriction, no further outgoing transfer could clear without review. I had given her the authorization 2 weeks earlier. The word I sent at dinner was the trigger. She filed within 4 minutes of receiving it. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before 5. I sat on the edge of the bed in my childhood bedroom. We had kept to the tradition of spending the night apart and stayed still for a while, looking at the light through the curtains. I thought about whether I was making a mistake. Not about the attorney, not about the authorization I'd given her, about the marriage itself. I went through every possible explanation for the transfers one more time. Maybe they were payments to a vendor Marcus had handled himself for a surprise element. Maybe there was a reason I hadn't found. Maybe I had flagged something innocent and I was about to walk into my own wedding with legal machinery primed for a scenario that wasn't going to happen. Then I thought about Marcus signing page 7 without reading it. About the seating chart changed without asking me. About Patricia's voice saying I was still finding my footing. About the look on Marcus's face when his mother made decisions, not resistance, just relief that someone else was deciding. I thought, I want to be wrong about this. I got dressed anyway. I went to my wedding. He was warm during the ceremony. He held my hands and looked at me the way he looked at me when we were alone, when his mother wasn't in the room. I said I do, and I meant it for the version of him I had loved for 3 years. I tried not to think about the bank statement. He didn't say anything before the ceremony. He didn't say anything during cocktail hour. He was kind and attentive and everything he had been for 3 years, right up until he picked up the microphone at dinner. When Marcus said, "I have a surprise," I felt the particular stillness that comes when something you've been half bracing for finally arrives. Not shock, just a quiet recognition. Oh, so this is it. This is when. He talked for about 2 minutes. He spoke about his mother's sacrifices over the years, about wanting to give back, about how honoring family first was the right way to begin a marriage. He described signing documents to transfer his interest in the condo and both cars to his mother. He confirmed that he had already moved the joint savings into an account she controlled. He framed all of it as a gift, as love, as the kind of gesture a devoted son makes. He used the word honor 3 times. Patricia was in the front row, hands folded, nodding slowly, the nod of someone watching a plan go the way it was supposed to go. Several people were applauding, clearly under the impression this was a touching family moment. A few others had gone quiet, either understanding what was being described or sensing that something was off. I was standing near the edge of the stage. I did not move. I kept my expression neutral, which was not difficult because I had already moved past the emotional part of this and into the procedural part. When he finished and turned to look at me with an expression that suggested he expected acknowledgement, some public version of acceptance that would seal the moment, I reached into my clutch. I sent one word to my attorney. He was still holding the microphone. He was still looking at me with that expression when I hit send. My attorney's confirmation came to my phone about 90 seconds after I sent the word. Dispute notification submitted, bank review initiated, emergency motion being drafted. I walked to the AV station at the back of the room. I had introduced myself to the coordinator earlier in the evening. I make a habit of knowing where things are and who's managing them. He looked up when I came over. I said, "I need to put something on the screen." He looked at me. He had been watching the room during Marcus's announcement, so he was not entirely surprised. I said, "It's my wedding." He asked what I needed displayed. I showed him my phone, the attorney's confirmation, and the document she had forwarded along with it. He connected my phone to the display system. I want to be clear about what went on that screen, because this part matters. I did not put up anything embarrassing or designed to humiliate. I did not show photographs or private communications. What I showed was three things, all from records I was entitled to access, and all account numbers had been redacted. The first was the joint account transaction history for the past 6 weeks. 4 transfers, dates, amounts. I was a joint account holder. That information was mine. The second was the relevant page of the prenuptial agreement, with the clause highlighted and Marcus's signature visible at the bottom, alongside his attorney's initials. The third was the confirmation from my attorney. Dispute notification, filed with bank. Account under review. Emergency motion in preparation. The screen went live while Marcus was still standing near the front of the room, still holding the microphone, still looking in my direction. I would say the silence lasted about 5 seconds. Then it broke in several directions at once. People near the screen were leaning toward each other, reading and asking questions under their breath. Someone's glass went over. At least 2 people had stood up to see the screen better. The applause had stopped entirely. Marcus's phone lit up on the table in front of where he was standing. Patricia leaned toward him and read the notification over his shoulder. The bank's compliance process had sent an alert to Marcus as the joint account holder, flagging the account for review. She had been sitting in the front row with the particular ease of someone watching a plan execute. The expression she made when she read that notification was one I had never seen from her before. The specific look of someone whose control has stopped working. Marcus had not moved. He was still holding the microphone, still standing in the same spot where he had made his announcement, as though he was waiting for a situation to resolve that was not going to resolve the way he had imagined. I walked back to the front of the room. I held out my hand. He gave me the microphone automatically, the way someone moves on reflex when they haven't fully caught up yet. I said, "The prenuptial agreement Marcus signed gives me grounds to seek emergency preservation of our marital assets when joint property is transferred without my consent. My attorney filed a dispute notification with the bank during this dinner. The account is under review. Her contact information is on the screen if you have questions." I put the microphone on the table. Patricia stood up. She said this was a family matter. She said I had no right to do this in front of everyone. She said whatever was happening between us should have stayed private. I didn't respond to her. I had said what I had to say. I turned to my parents, who were at the family table. My mother was already standing. My father was a half-second behind her. I walked out of my own wedding reception. My parents found me in the hallway outside the reception room. My mother put her hand on my arm and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. My father had the look of a man with many things to say who had made a decision to save them for a different time. We rode the elevator down together. I looked at my reflection in the elevator doors, still in the dress, the flowers still pinned in my hair from that morning, and thought about how much of that day had been planned and which plans had actually held. In the lobby, I stopped for a moment. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was aware of being very, very tired in the specific way that comes at the end of a long period of sustained tension, when the thing you've been bracing for has finally happened and the bracing is over. My mother asked once if I was okay. I said yes, in the specific sense that I was functional and the process was running and I wasn't going to fall apart tonight. She seemed to understand that version. My attorney sent 3 updates on the drive back to my parents' house. The bank was processing the dispute notification. Emergency court filings were being prepared for the following morning. The prenup was attached to everything. The legal process took about 6 months to resolve, and parts of it I will leave to the attorneys to characterize in detail. My attorney filed for divorce and sought emergency preservation of the marital assets. She filed a motion to enforce the prenup, relying on the account records, the prenup's tracing provisions, and Marcus's own public announcement as direct evidence of intent to transfer jointly held assets without my consent. Several things happened over those months. The joint savings transfer was the most straightforward claim. That money had moved. The prenup's contribution tracing provisions were clear, and we had documentation showing what I had put in and when. That was recovered. The attempted transfers of the apartment and the cars were more complicated legally. Property transfers between co-owners typically require both parties to be involved, depending on how the title is held. The documents Marcus had signed turned out to be procedurally insufficient. They had not actually completed the transfers they purported to make. He had announced, at our wedding, an accomplishment he had not fully managed. What he had actually accomplished was draining the savings and signing paperwork that didn't hold up under legal scrutiny. My attorney pursued the evidence we had and didn't overstate the rest. The prenup held up on every point she raised it. Marcus hired an attorney. Patricia hired her own. The process was long and, I gather, expensive for everyone involved. I got the condo. I got my portion of the savings. The cars were divided. I don't know the full state of their situation after the proceedings, and I stopped following that story. I had one direct conversation with Marcus, about a month into the process. He called on a Sunday evening. He said he hadn't expected me to respond the way I did. He said that if I had just talked to him about my concerns, we could have worked something out. I thought about what working something out would have looked like from his perspective. I thought about him standing at the altar that afternoon, warm and attentive and everything he had been when we were alone together, while the joint savings were already sitting in his mother's account. I said, "You thought I wouldn't do anything." He didn't answer that directly. He said the situation was complicated. He said his mother had been struggling financially and he had wanted to help her without making it into a whole thing. I said, "You were wrong about me," and ended the call. I haven't spoken to him since. Everything else went through attorneys, which was how it was supposed to work. People have asked me how I stayed calm. During the reception, in the car on the way home, in the months of proceedings after. They want to understand how you stand on a stage at your own wedding and do what I did without falling apart. I think the honest answer is that by the time Marcus picked up that microphone, I had already lived through most of the fear and uncertainty. 2 weeks of not knowing for certain what was coming. I had worked through the possible explanations and found them insufficient. I had thought through outcomes I hoped I would never need. What remained in that moment was the procedural part. And the procedural part I was prepared for. He had been wrong about me from the beginning. Patricia had decided I was someone who would absorb things rather than document them. She had looked at 3 years of me not causing conflict and concluded that meant I wouldn't. What she had not accounted for was that I'm a financial analyst. I track risk. I build documentation into everything. I read contracts before I sign them, and I watch other people when they sign things. He signed every page of the prenup. He signed page 7 the same way he signed all the others without stopping, without reading, because he had decided it was a formality. That was true of how he treated a lot of things that involved me. He treated the down payment I had contributed to the condo as a detail. He treated the transfers he made as something I would absorb and not address. He treated our marriage as something that, once official, would make me manageable. He was wrong about all of it. You sign a document, every page matters. He found that out at his own wedding reception. I'm not going to say the year after was easy. Divorce proceedings are not easy, even when you have documentation and a clear prenup and a competent attorney. There is still time and energy and a certain amount of emotional cost in just moving through the process. There are hearings and filings and delays, and moments when you have to read through the same documents again and remember what happened. But I have the condo, which I now live in alone and which is considerably quieter. I have my portion of the savings. I have detailed records of every contribution I made and every transfer that happened, which I keep because documentation matters. It has always mattered. It will continue to matter. And I have, somewhere in a file in my home office, page 7 of the prenuptial agreement, with Marcus's signature on it. with his attorney's initials in the margin. The 200 people at our wedding were in the room when the screen went up. They saw the account records. They saw his signature on the prenup. They saw Patricia's face when she read the bank notification on Marcus's phone. They saw Marcus hand me the microphone when I held out my hand. He chose that room. He chose that audience. He chose that evening to make his announcement. He just didn't get to choose the ending.